Fantastic. Okay. So thank you very much for assigning me this paper to discuss. Actually, I had read it already before, which, was supposed to make my work easier, but actually it wasn't easy because this is a published paper. This is something that we haven't mentioned. It's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's very difficult for the discussant to actually find something to say, right? Plus, I'm not a psychologist, but actually the paper connects to a lot of the topics I'm interested in political science and economics. So I'll try to offer just some broad thoughts and questions that I found really interesting. But first, I'll summarize it because I think it's useful, to be on the same page. The paper is very rich. So Rasha presented some of the results, but actually there's something like 10 experiments in there. So there are like tons of findings, important policy implications. Here are the findings as I read it. People overestimate the proportion of minorities and underestimate the proportion of majorities. That's the main thing. But this is true when estimating from memory, when we're asking people to remember how many or what the proportion was of minority groups, both in a real setting in Hebrew University and in a controlled setting in experiments. It's true when estimating from experience, from perception, when people actually just see the group and then immediately after have to give the proportion. And then this estimation bias is larger when it is from memory than from experience. One thing that was not mentioned, the reason, evidence for the mechanism behind that is that minorities are rare and therefore salient, and people prioritize them also for visual perception. If they are to, look to identify what's around, they will look at minorities first. But there were even more interesting findings, at least to me. One is that these biases are affected not just by statistical prevalence, by what we see right at that moment around us, but also by social knowledge. If we know a group to be a minority in our society, this is going to matter for how much we overestimate the perception when we see it in the experiment. Very interestingly, social attitudes and attitudes towards these groups do not predict this estimation bias. So disliking a particular group doesn't mean that we're going to overestimate it by more, which I found fascinating. There was a lot of things here that I didn't know. And then this overestimation, or just coming up with a number by just seeing the group, predicts less support for diversity, which is the policy part of this. So when I read the paper, the first time I had read it very superficially, I was reminded of this. I don't know if you can see it here. It was very hard to actually copy this graph to the presentation. This is from a survey that was done by YouGov in a representative sample of Americans, asking them to estimate the proportions of different groups in the US. So Americans think that 30% of the US is Jewish, 30% is Muslim, and the rest of the 40% is Hispanic. And that's basically the United States. So I found this hilarious. This graph is really funny, and you can read the other groups as well. And you can see immediately the pattern, right? Smaller groups are overestimated, larger groups are underestimated. There's a general tendency towards 50%, so people have the tendency to get close to that percentage. This is, however, not what drives in their entirety the findings of the paper of Rasha. This is really the context, and this is really what this is speaking to. As I said, I'm not a psychologist, but in the fields that I work in economics and political science, specifically in the study of immigration, it was known that people vastly overestimate the size of immigrant populations in every country in the world. What I would have thought, or what I knew, is that this overestimation also kind of relates to attitudes towards immigration. So the United States has fewer immigrants than Canada, but Americans tend to overestimate the size of the immigrant group more than Canadians do. So that was something that I knew, but this is a paper that carefully documents this more broader bias in a controlled setting. It shows that this is not just a bias towards 50%. And what I found really important as a contribution is that it provides evidence that this bias is not necessarily driven by prejudice. Even the minority group overestimates the size of the minority group. And so that's something that I don't think was known, or certainly, we always had this impression that it's, if you're a racist, you overestimate the size of the African American group, but that's not what is the case given the findings of this paper. It's our cognitive function. It's how our brain works. Still, even though this is not driven by prejudice, it does affect views on policy in support of diversity. So we might be less supportive of diversity, not because we dislike minorities, but we just think that minorities are more than they actually are. which is also really important. So, this is a really big contribution, and this is just to how I see the contribution of the paper given the disciplines that I come from. So, as I said, not a psychologist, published paper, no criticism of the methods or anything of the sort. I just wanted to put out there some questions that I had and things that I would like to know more on, and I think I would find them interesting directions maybe for future research. So the first question that I had while I was reading it is, what is special about social groups? So I think it's known, and I have one paper with a psychologist through which I learned about this study, that it's a general pattern that people overestimate small proportions and underestimate large proportions in everything. And so what the study shows, the first three graphs, it's the relationship between the true proportion on the x-axis and the judged perceived proportion by experiment participants on the y-axis for things like, what's the proportion of the letter A in a string of letters? That's the first graph, the first study. Or the second one is, what's the proportion of white and black dots in a screen? So that's something that people do in general. It doesn't have to be social groups specifically. Of course, they do it with demographics as well. That comes from the same study that shows that this is the relationship that we see when we ask people to estimate, the proportion of Muslims or the proportion of Christians. And so my question was, is this just another case or another application of this cognitive pattern that we see in other things? Or is there more to it? And my reading, at least of one finding, is that there's more to it. One thing that the paper shows that we didn't know before is that social knowledge also plays a role, right? That's a new finding. It's more than just reasoning. What we know about our society affects how we estimate these proportions. But what I think is not fully disentangled in the paper is social knowledge of something and socially loaded identities, groups like Arabs and Jews, African Americans and whites. So, we might have social knowledge of the fact that we live in a country where, the majority of people are blonde, but there are people who have different color hair. And we would see that transmitted in the experiment. Does it matter that this is not just blonde people, that these are African Americans? That's what I would like to see whether there is more or less overestimation or what exactly. So that was a question that Neta asked, right? What about the blondes? So I think that would be really interesting to know. The second question that I had is the role of social attitudes. Actually, here I'm convinced. I came with very different priors when I was reading this, and I think it's because I knew this work in political science that always connected higher racial resentment, for example, with more overestimation of the presence of African Americans in neighborhoods. And the idea there was that, well, I will overestimate them more because I dislike them, and I tend to notice them and think that they're everywhere, something like that. But as I was preparing the discussion, I was looking at some more recent studies, and this is a recently published paper by the late Alberto Alesina and co-authors in economics that would confirm the findings of Rasha's paper. So this is a paper in which misperceptions about immigrants are examined. And there what they find is that for both liberals and conservatives in the US, the overestimation of the percentage of immigrants is the same. What actually people tend to misperceive differently about immigrants is their characteristics, like how many of them would be unemployed or the crime rate among immigrants, but not the size. So this would fit. So I was very interested in that. There's older studies and there's new studies coming in to show that this is actually not the case, and I would like to know more. I'm still not 100% convinced. I think there's something about asking attitudes, things like thermometers, right after having shown people a matrix of black and white faces. There are demand effects in reporting things in thermometer scales. It would be really nice to have a setting in which attitudes are fully decoupled from the actual experiment of estimation. You mean the comparison of
whether if she would have done that on blondes,
where
we don't necessarily have an attitude relevant for blondes, would that do that to you?
Maybe if the overestimation is exactly the same for blondes as it is for these groups, that definitely would speak to that. Yeah. What I had in mind is more like elicit their attitudes at some point in time and then later, have them do these estimates or vice versa, such that the two things are not connected. This is what I was thinking about. But it was just because I found it surprising. I find the experiment convincing, and I also see this new evidence. I think it would be nice to I don't know, bring this home as like, this is new, we know this, forget about these old studies. This is what we should be looking at. And then the last part has to do with policy implications, which is the very important part, right? Because it seems like one recommendation that could come out of this is that if we tell people that they're wrong, that they're actually overestimating the size of minorities, then this will increase their support for diversity promoting policies. And here I really wanted to know what Rasha thinks about all these studies that are being done recently. I think there's like an explosion of them in political science at least. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the last slide. That show that correcting misperceptions, at least about proportions of immigrants, really does nothing to people's attitudes about immigrants and nothing about their policy preferences. Doesn't mean that they like them or they're in support of more immigration. And so I was wondering how that fits with what we see here. One thing I was thinking is this a narrow policy recommendation? Like if I'm the dean of an academic institution, well, of course, I shouldn't decide how much black faculty to hire by walking around on campus and making a guess about how many black professors there are, right? Like I should look at the numbers. But if I told people what's the representation of African Americans in different sectors, the actual numbers, would that increase their support for affirmative action? I'm not fully convinced. It would be nice to see more work in that direction. So I think I'll skip my last slide. It's just more like, you know, there's just this whole literature in economics and political science that I think this really speaks to. They're trying to find out what these misperceptions, how they're related to attitudes, and this paper really has a lot to add to that by saying this is not underlying prejudice, this is a human feature. And I find it totally plausible because it really fits with the work that I'm doing with this psychologist that says that people are really bad at estimating proportions, but they might be good at estimating relative sizes of groups. So, you know, you don't know the percentage of a group, but you know it might be the largest group among all the minorities in your neighborhood, and that affects how you feel about them. So I thought that fit right in, and it's like perfectly complementary. So fantastic, yeah.